Welcome back to Outside Views, and bro, we need to talk. And today we're tackling a colossal question in British history. Is there simply no Brexit without Maggie? To frame the UK's long tortured relationship with the European project, the relationship status is without a doubt, it's complicated. But to truly understand the catastrophe that unfolded on June 23rd in 2016, we have to look back to the moment the rot truly set in. And yes, that moment belongs to Margaret Thatcher. To say her nationalist-driven politics was the sole cause of Brexit is an oversimplification, but it is a profoundly true statement that her actions initiated the irreversible process of erosion that led the island to leave the European Union. The initial entry back in January 1973 under Prime Minister Edward Heath was hailed with a fanfare for Europe, a moment of genuine hope. Despite the public being divided even then, a subsequent 1975 referendum under James Harold Wilson delivered a resounding mandate for Europe. 67.2% of voters said yes. But 4 decades later, the result was a narrow, devastating exit. But what changed? The answer is a deliberate, calculated ideological shift that began on September 20th in 1988 with Margaret Thatcher's defining speech at the College of Europe in Brugge. And that speech was not just an argument. It was a stake driven into the heart of the European ideal, marking the formal beginning of Euroscepticism within the Conservative Party. Thatcher's attack on the European Commission's push for centralization was explosive. She was enraged by the words of European Commission President Jacques Delors, who had spoken openly about the idea that 80% of economic laws might be made by the EU within a decade. And when Delors subsequently demanded the introduction of a European government, Thatcher's reaction was seismic. She didn't just disagree, she saw it as an existential threat to British sovereignty. Well, I personally believe her statement was the rhetorical ground zero for the Leave campaign that followed decades later. In a television interview, she dismissed the notion of a European superstate as castles in the air, and her official message was even clearer: a nationalist rallying cry. We have not successfully rolled back the frontiers of the state in Britain, only to see them reimposed at a European level by a European superstate exercising a new dominance from Brussels. The tragedy is that her Foreign and Commonwealth Office had prepared a script urging her to speak of the economic benefits of the single market, the success that European trade brought to the United Kingdom. But after Delors' inflammatory speech, she threw that script away, choosing instead to unleash the nationalist anti-European sentiments that had been bubbling beneath the surface there. And this single decisive moment did 2 things. I almost showed it in the German way, but that means something very different in Britain. It lost her support of her Foreign Secretary Geoffrey Howe, and 2 years later, her premiership. And more importantly, it fundamentally reshaped the soul of the Conservative Party, creating a political monster that would eventually devour itself. The Euroscepticism she introduced was now permanently installed in the Tory DNA, a constant source of internal, almost civil war-like fighting, as her successor John Major observed. Major tried to bridge the gap to make Britain a leading force in Europe, but he was doomed to fail. The Maastricht Treaty, which secured opt-outs for the UK from the single currency and the social chapter, the elements most despised by anti-federalists, was still not enough for many Tories. His plan to adopt a wait-and-see approach to the euro, to hold a referendum later, was the weakest possible position. It guaranteed the issue would fester. And even the Labour government under Tony Blair, which sought to prepare and decide on the euro, eventually backed off, recognizing the widespread public rejection of the single currency. The Conservative Party, following their defeat, found a unifying purpose in their campaign to save the pound, ensuring that the anti-European stance remained their core position. And this climate allowed the UK Independence Party, which rejected not only the euro but EU membership itself, to win seats in the European Parliament for the first time in 1999. The anti-European tide was rising, directly feeding on the Euroscepticism Thatcher had mainstreamed. And then came the economic crises, which provided the second essential ingredient for Brexit. Gordon Brown's premiership was overshadowed by the 2007 international financial crisis, the failure of Northern Rock, and the ensuing recession. Labour's poll numbers collapsed, paving the way for David Cameron. Cameron, a self-described modern conservative who championed social issues, inherited a Conservative Party that was still obsessed with Europe. His own stance, hardened by the Eurozone crisis, was to rule out joining the single currency, but the pressure from the Eurosceptic wing of his party was relentless. When European leaders, led by Angela Merkel and Nicolas Sarkozy, demanded a change to the Lisbon Treaty in 2011 to stabilize the euro, and then rejected Cameron's demands for British interests to be respected, it confirmed his sense of the UK's instability within the Union. And this culminated in his disastrous defining speech of January 23rd in 2013, where he promised to renegotiate Britain's EU treaties and, most critically, hold a referendum on continued membership. Cameron, who actually warned against the consequences of leaving, inadvertently handed a loaded gun to the very extremists he sought to placate. He wanted to avoid Brexit, but he was the one who made it possible, trapped by the Eurosceptic machinery Thatcher had built. And the final act was carried out by the populists, Nigel Farage and Boris Johnson. And current reports make it clear that the Brexit vote was not just a result of Thatcher's politics. It was the ultimate consequence of those ideas finding fertile ground in the international crises of 2007 to 2015. Thatcher's Euroscepticism, what is the word in English here? Metastasized, feeding on the electorate's dissatisfaction with migration, the feeling of being left behind by economic change, and a toxic rising tide of British nationalism. Farage and Johnson weaponized this deep-seated anxiety using the foundation laid by Thatcher's distant, antagonistic relationship with Brussels. So, was Brexit a consequence of Margaret Thatcher's anti-European politics? Absolutely, but in an indirect and therefore more insidious way. Her Brooke speech was the moment the Conservative Party consciously opened the door to the forces of nationalism and isolationism. And every subsequent leader, from Major to Cameron, tried to approach the continent to establish the UK as a leading force, but they were constantly undermined by the Eurosceptic faction that Thatcher had legitimized. The current crisis in the Conservative Party, the rise of Reform UK, and the economic damage we see today are all the painful, unavoidable legacy of that one moment in 1988. Thatcher did not vote for Brexit, but without her, the political soil would never have been prepared for the seeds of populism sown by Farage and Johnson. She provided the ideology, the rhetoric, and the crucial political space for the catastrophic era to occur. Her actions were the beginning of the end of the UK's time in Europe, and everyone there is still paying the price for her nationalist vision today. It's a profound political tragedy, and one that, in my strong view, could have been completely avoided if a more moderate, pro-European course had been maintained. But I'm also really interested in your thoughts on this one. Was Maggie Thatcher a core architect of Brexit? And if you want to see another video right now, the next one is right here in the end screen. I'll see you there. I'll be back.